Hello, hello, hello! As I'm sure you've seen, Reform UK have decided to pursue political self-destruction by attacking the most popular man in the party, Rupert Lowe. In an unceremonious press release on Twitter, Reform accused Mr. Lowe of threatening behaviour towards their Muslim chairman Zia Yusuf, as well as implicating him in 2 workplace harassment cases. Naturally, Rupert Lowe denies all charges and claims to have not seen any credible evidence, likely because Reform are talking out of their arses and Rupert Lowe did nothing wrong. But still, the suddenness and seeming stupidity of this move has left many confused, which simply begs the question, what the hell is going on in Reform, and what will this mean for the future of the party, and indeed for Britain on the whole? Watch this to find out. Reform UK, which was born out of the Brexit Party, has, since the last general election, been somewhat of a political black swan. For a good while now, and especially since the general election, Reform has been steadily rising in the polls. Now, I'm not your typical pundit who pretends that polls are true reflections of national sentiment. I believe they exist primarily to manufacture opinion rather than report it. Yet, with either my analysis or a more conventional analysis, the same conclusion can be drawn that the establishment regime of this country appears to be gearing up for a 2029 Reform-led government. By all appearances, the party was genuinely rising in popularity. Yet, the reason I call this a paradox is that at the same time as Reform was rising in the polls, it was further and further alienating its own vanguard and pushing out the very people who stuck with it when times were toughest. Essentially, Reform is meant to be a right-wing party, but anyone who's actually right-wing within the party is severely pissed off. Since the general election, we have seen a whole slew of resignations and demotions within Reform. Gawain Towler, who has been Farage's right-hand man for decades, was pushed off to the side. Ben Habib, who's also been with Farage for donkey's years, was boycotted from talking to local branches, quit upon hearing this, only to have his departure hailed as a champagne moment by Farage. Howard Cox, Reform's London mayoral candidate, quit the party over his disagreements with Reform. Entire local branches, unhappy that Reform HQ were trying to force candidates on them, resigned in protest. Many branch heads and other candidates have also resigned. I've even found out that I'm on their blacklist, which I find rather amusing. And now, Rupert Lowe, the most popular man within the party, was attacked out of nowhere and had the party whip removed. Yet, despite party headquarters being more or less despised by Reform's OGs, the party is polling at its highest levels ever. That is the paradox. Well, it would be a paradox, save for the fact that it makes total sense. If you understand how the establishment regime works, that they have the power to manufacture and manipulate opinion, and that they ultimately act as one, regardless of which party is in government, you will understand that Reform is being promoted by the regime precisely because they are casting out and pissing off their original hardcore vanguard. But wait a minute, the establishment wants Reform? How could that possibly be? Well, you'll have to watch some of the videos in my anti-politics playlist, but the gist of it is this. A. Reform will get otherwise disillusioned people brought back into the pantomime of politics. B. Reform will put away the woke stuff, specifically the left-wing anti-Semitism. And C. Reform will inspire nationalism, so more white boys can die for globalist or Zionist wars. Reform must do all of that while simultaneously keeping to the establishment agenda and ultimately keeping to liberal democratic ideals, something of which even Rupert Lowe is guilty. This is why Reform hails net zero immigration as a flagship policy, despite the policy actually being a one-for-one demographic replacement. It's why Farage refuses to commit to the deportation of all illegal immigrants. It's why the supposed right-wing populist party has a Muslim chairman. It's why even Rupert Lowe ultimately favours colourblind meritocracy over genuine nationalism. I mean, look at his tweet here from the 28th of February, before any of this recent drama kicked off. I don't think that MPs should be treating anyone differently based on the colour of their skin, including white people. We must reject poisonous identity politics and judge people based on competence and competence alone. Merit, merit, merit. That's what it's all about. As you can see here, this is nothing other than colourblind liberalism, not true right-wing politics. Reform has always been containment and has always been ultimately in favour of the capitalist establishment regime. Peter Hitchens was ultimately correct to call them a Thatcher tribute band, with Thatcher being someone who laid the cultural foundation for the rise of Tony Blair. Still, the sheer speed at which reform has taken off the cloak of based right-wing rhetoric has been shocking, and in my opinion, utterly foolish. How anyone could still believe they're right-wing is frankly beyond me. Rupert Lowe was, in my opinion, the last line of defence for OG reform, hence why I thought he was in on it all along. You see, I've known reform was containment for a while now, as has anyone with half a brain. So, as far as I could see, Rupert Lowe was an intrinsic part of the containment. As far as I was concerned, Rupert, whether he was sincere in his statements or not, was only permitted because he kept the right wing of the party hopeful. He was reform's top man, the most based man in Parliament. In fact, arguably the only based man in Parliament. Yes, I can see that he is still a small L, small d Liberal Democrat who believes in colourblind meritocracy, but he was relentlessly challenging the mainstream narrative and giving air to right-wing talking points on so many issues. Whilst Farage was saying we must coexist with Muslims, Lowe was saying we need to send the buggers home. So, for many people, he was the sole reason they stuck around. And that was the role I thought he was there to serve, and serve it he did. But now, with his unceremonious denouncement, the only conclusion I can draw is that Lowe was not part of some clever plan to keep reform's base hopeful, but instead was a true anti-regime dissident. And of course, whether the role for Rupert as the far end of containment was truly the role he had been given, it is a role that he filled perfectly. Many people who would otherwise have reached the obvious conclusion that reform is not right-wing and only serves to contain right-wing energy, stayed loyal to the party solely because of Rupert Lowe. The problem for reform, though, is that such a role is one that becomes vital to the whole operation. The popularity of the right-wing element of reform became solely invested in Rupert Lowe. So, when the party decided to cast Lowe aside, they cast aside their core supporters with him. Meanwhile, reform's accusation has been so implausible that it is Rupert Lowe who has come out on top of this. Obviously, I await more recent opinion polls, and frankly, I expect to be disappointed anyway, but what reform has done is send a clear signal to the actual right wing of the party that reform is not for them. If the purpose of reform is containment, they've not been doing a great job at it at all. They've been so bad, in fact, that I almost wonder whether they're playing 4D chess to purposefully make as many people disillusioned with politics as they can. In any case, let's now take a look at what was said between Reform and Rupert Lowe. So, it started out with this statement from Reform UK, signed by Lee Anderson and Zia Youssef. I encourage you to pause the video to read the whole thing, but what's essentially being said is, in these first 3 paragraphs, they're talking about this allegations from 2 female employees, and in the last one, they're saying Mr. Lowe made threats against Zia Youssef. Now the response by Rupert Lowe. Again, I encourage you to pause this to read the whole thing, but what is essentially being said here is that Rupert Lowe is disappointed but not surprised to read untrue and false allegations. He's spoken with the KC, he hasn't seen any evidence, he's tried to cooperate but they won't cooperate with him, he wants to speak to Nigel but Nigel won't have it, and he's generally very disappointed and denies everything. Then you have a tweet like this: I asked reasonable and constructive questions of Nigel Farage and Reform's leadership, following months of pushing for progress behind closed doors. Yeah, what's happened here is essentially that Rupert Lowe recently questioned Nigel Farage a little bit, saying that he needs to change the way he's doing things, and very shortly after, you get this allegation. Here's another tweet saying there's zero evidence of him making derogatory or discriminatory remarks. Here's Rupert Lowe saying he feels sorry for the millions of decent people who've been supporting reform and that they've been let down by the malicious circus and that they deserve so much better. Here's a far more personal tweet talking about his betrayal and at the end asking Nigel to have a dinner with him. Here's a more interesting revelation saying that one of the staff members involved confirms that it had nothing to do with Rupert Lowe in the first place. And I think it's been said somewhere else that the other allegation either was dropped or also didn't have anything to do with Rupert Lowe personally. And lastly, there's this statement here from Rupert's parliamentary team saying that, he's a decent bloke, he's a family guy, an honest man. They'd never expect this of him. It's totally a hit job. Rupert's a decent bloke. And yeah, clearly Reform has nothing here. There is no evidence. The harassment claims are bunk and or irrelevant. Was Lowe passive-aggressive towards Zia Yusuf? Perhaps. Nobody can know. Though I must say that even when I met Zia, one of the first thoughts that popped into my head was that I could take him in a fight. In any case, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as pretty much anyone else is concerned, Rupert Lowe is totally in the clear. This is an obvious hit job, and Reform are a bunch of wankers. So the question must be asked, why do all of this? As I see it, there are 4 theories that could explain what Reform has done. Firstly, that what Reform claim is true and that they are following best procedure. Secondly, that this is an egotistical move by Nigel Farage to exile a potential rival. Thirdly, that this is a ploy to merge with the Conservatives. And lastly, that this is a 4D chess move to boost the profile of Rupert Lowe and or destroy the reputation among the right of Reform. The first theory is the simplest of the 4 and also the easiest to disregard. As has already been borne out in the tweets, Reform has no leg to stand on here. One of the women has supposedly removed her complaint, whilst the other has said that hers has nothing to do with Rupert Lowe himself. And whether or not the threats against Zia Yusuf are true, they supposedly happened in December and we are now in March. So why would they even leave such a thing if it was a real concern? And in any case, Lowe appears to be fully willing to cooperate, and if anything, seems rather frustrated by the lack of cooperation from Reform's side. So it's safe to say that theory 1 is not true. The second theory is a little bit more plausible, but I don't think it's all that likely. As believable as it is that Farage, who acts more like a political celebrity rather than a serious politician, would act irrationally to protect his position and his ego, I don't quite believe that he would be so stupid and so tactless. The hit job against Lowe is so blatant and so unconvincing, even to the normies, that I simply cannot believe Farage would be so dumb. However, I do think that it'll be this theory that is sold to the masses in order to stop people from thinking harder about what the real motive behind this all could be. After all, that was the narrative wheeled out after Ben Habib left. The third theory then is the one that I personally think is most likely, though I also suspect that many people will struggle to accept it, purely because in the frame of electoral politics, it makes zero bloody sense. Reform was top of the polls. Lowe was a very popular Reform MP who was pretty much solely responsible for keeping the right of the party engaged and hopeful. The attack on Lowe is an act of electoral self-harm so severe that no serious party trying to win would ever do it. So why would they do it? Well, let's for a moment assume that a Reform-Tory merger is the goal. That goal would be very unpopular among many Reform members and supporters. So, if Reform is at the top of the polls, it would make no sense to side with the Tories, who are universally seen as losers. If Reform simply doesn't need them to succeed, then why bloody merge with them? By removing Lowe, however, Reform may have tanked its poll lead and simultaneously cut off the right of the party. Now, they won't be so strong in the polls, and the median Reform member and supporter is far more to the Liberal side than they had been previously. In this case, a Reform-Tory merger, or a Reform-Tory coalition, would be accepted by far more people, and also may be seen as a far more politically expedient choice. Most important to note is that all of this only makes sense if Reform is struggling in the polls. In any case, why would Reform want to do a deal with the Tories? To be honest, that's still a little bit beyond me. Maybe there's something in the Tory structure that the establishment doesn't want to let go of. Maybe there's just too much infrastructure there. Otherwise, I would normally have assumed that there's nothing the Tories have that Reform couldn't build itself. Reform has quite openly been recruiting ex-Tories, though I had assumed that this was an effort to take over the Tory party by gradually assimilating its old infrastructure and top people. I had thought that Kemi was a jobber, there in place to make the Tories look weak so Reform could look strong. In such a case, Reform would have no need to cast out Lowe, nor would Lowe have much hope to pull off a coup against Farage. I mean, the party constitution has been designed to make that sort of thing impossible. So there are still questions with this theory, but I still think it's the most plausible so far. Lastly though, there is the fourth theory. This is the black sheep of the four in that it posits that this action wasn't designed to hurt Rupert Lowe, but actually to boost him. In a way, this is a post hoc rationalisation to try and find some sanity in this otherwise insane chapter, but it's still worth considering. The theory is that the hit job has been so bad, so unbelievable, that Rupert Lowe was only ever going to come out on top. Now, with it clear that Reform has positioned itself against the right, Lowe remains as the sole right-wing man in Parliament. Again, I still know that he is just a colourblind liberal, but if we're talking relatively, then yes, he is the most right-wing man in Parliament. Now, what exactly Rupert Lowe does next will be most telling. If he stays as an independent MP, then the theory that this is designed to boost his profile is likely untrue. If, however, he either starts his own party, joins another party, or somehow manages to take over Reform, then Lowe may indeed be the latest cutting edge of containment, with this designed to boost his reputation. Alternatively, and perhaps most interestingly, this may be a plot by people on our side of the matter. You see, people like me who recognise that Reform is containment really want the party to die. Though the jury's still out about what the mainstream will think, for many people on the actual right, Reform is now dead to them. So there may be many canny accelerationists within Reform who want the party to die. A lot of the OGs were truly based, perhaps even entirely true right. It's not implausible then that some of those guys, having seen the direction taken by Farage and Yusuf, would want people to wake up to the true nature of Reform as soon as possible by casting out the popular right-wing figureheads like Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe. Again, most people bought into the lie of democracy won't understand this, but Reform is containment and cannot ever offer a path for a true right-wing takeover of this country. As such, it is in the interest of those who do want a true right-wing takeover to wake as many people up to the reality of what's happening as soon as possible. A poorly executed hit job against Reform's top man is perfect at doing just that. And indeed, we're already seeing that many people are now leaving Reform. So yeah, it's all food for thought and it's still too early to call. It could of course be the case that different factions have different objectives that have aligned in the same way. It could be that Nigel Farage and Zia Yusuf want the Tory merger, whilst other people want Reform supporters to wake up to what's happening. Or, who knows, maybe it's just Farage's ego after all. Though let me ask you what you think. What indicators would you expect to see if it was Theory 2, Theory 3 or Theory 4? Do you think that Rupert Lowe has come out of this better or worse? And do you think that was by design or not? I generally err on the side of believing that incompetence is a lie, hence why I'm more drawn to Theory 3 or Theory 4, but please let me know what you think. Otherwise, I am very interested to see what will happen with this. If it's worth making a follow-up video about, then I will do just that. In the meantime, I thank you for watching. Channel monetization should be on the way now, but I am still a good way off full monetization. So, as always, please like, subscribe, and God save the King.